So welcome everyone. My name is Burgess and I'm a fourth year PhD candidate in the Media, Technology and Society program here at Northwestern. And today I'll be presenting on research conducted alongside Jordan Eschler, formerly a postdoc here at Northwestern, and advised by professors Madhu Reddy and David Moore, both professors here at Northwestern. So as many of you may have seen, mental health has been a hot topic of discussion during this pandemic. For instance, for individuals managing depression, day-to-day mental health routines have been significantly disrupted. And in this space, technology-mediated forms of care, like telemedicine, and also using social media or other digital technologies to connect with loved ones have really come to the forefront. But this raises a longer running question around what are the effects of digital technologies on mental health? And so for digital mental health researchers, they've long viewed technology as a positive avenue to expand coverage to people who couldn't access it otherwise, and to support day-to-day mental health management, often from a smartphone that sits in your pocket. However, where a lot of this research focuses is on a single platform, so the benefits and cons of one app or one online community, when in fact that's not really how people use technologies day to day. People use all sorts of technologies, often simultaneously. And so for our population of individuals managing depression, we wanted to know how they made decisions about their technology use across the variety of technologies they use in everyday life. And our research objective in doing this was to understand participants' lived experiences, both positive and negative, around their technology use and mental health management. To understand participants' reflections and behaviors, we used the theory of self-regulation from psychology, which Strauman defines as a process of improving cognitive, emotional, and behavioral habits for individuals managing depression. And the key here is a focus on first reflecting on behaviors and thoughts, and then creating short and long-term personal goals within these three areas. So to understand people's reflections and behaviors, we carried out semi-structured interviews with 30 participants who had diagnosed depression between the ages of 18 and 72. All participants lived in a large city in the US Midwest, and once we'd collected the data, we analyzed it through this thematic analysis process. So what did we find? Well, firstly, we found that people use all sorts of technologies as part of their mental health self-management. About 50% of our participants used apps that were specifically developed for mental health management, things like the meditation app Calm and Headspace, but also we saw tons of other technologies that are part of people's mental health management process. Things like games and TV, texting, music, you name it. And so from this diversity of technologies, we saw that people were using them in the three main ways. The first was around cognitive self-regulation. And so this was how participants began to think about their technology use and how they use technology to address their negative thought patterns. And secondly, people discussed emotional self-regulation, which is participants' work to formulate and or maintain healthier emotional states related to their technology use. And thirdly, people also described behavioral self-regulation in our study, which were their efforts to design new behavioral habits around technology use. And I'll spend the rest of the findings digging into each of these three categories. So firstly, people described over time realizing that sometimes when they use technology, it negatively influenced their mental health. And so this was particularly around passive use or consumption of technology. So this looked like endlessly scrolling through social media or sitting down and watching tons of TV for a whole day. And when participants use technologies in these ways, for instance, social media, this could amplify their feelings of being separate or different from others, would often create pressure to show continual achievement, made people feel lonely or feel like they're missing out. And also, as people reflected on these processes over time, many people came to realize that it was wasting their time that they would rather spend on more enriching activities. And P19 speaks to this. She realized over time that she was going on Facebook when it would have been more beneficial for her to do some exercise. And she says, but on the whole, I'll feel so much better to exercise versus go on Facebook. Sometimes it's hard to give up this short-term pleasure for a longer-term pleasure. And so over time, she's realized that, in thinking and reflecting on her technology use, that there are things that she would rather do instead of scrolling through Facebook. And for participants, once they realized that they were falling into these negative patterns, they began to find creative ways to break them. And people did this primarily through becoming more intentional about how they're using technology. And there are two main strategies to do this. The first was limiting or controlling access to certain technology platforms, also known as keeping the bad out. And secondly, through seeking positive content or inviting the good in. And so as an example of limiting or controlling access, a number of participants were using Snapchat and found that over time, it actually caused a lot of anxiety because they'd see amazing, cool things their friends were posting constantly when they were suffering with motivation and energy issues. And so for these participants, they often carried out a blunt approach, simply deleting the technology. Other people would delete a technology off of their phone, but would still log in every now and then on their browser. And this made it a little bit harder to access the platform day to day. Finally, some participants, even if they wanted to get off of a technology, found that for different reasons that they couldn't. So for instance, one participant was a sorority president, and she described how she needed to be on Facebook for sorority business. So what she did is she created other strategies like only spending 1 hour per day on Facebook and only using it for the purposes of sorority business. Other people took a different approach, really trying to reframe what they were seeing on social media platforms. And so for P18, he described going and finding pages that posted cute animals or motivational sayings, saying, you find these little gold mines, you follow them, like them, and you get postings from them on a regular basis. And so through this process, he completely reconfigured what would have been his off-the-shelf Facebook experience, which would have been mostly content from his friends, and instead filled it with content that he thought better supported his mental health. Now, in addition to these cognitive self-regulation findings, people also use technology as part of their emotional self-regulation. And people describe primarily using technology in this way as a mental reset. And so for as an example, P2 describes how when she gets frustrated at work, she'll take 2 minutes, take a break, look at something else, laugh at a kitten video or something, and then get back to what I was doing. And so what's key about this activity versus that passive scrolling behavior that we saw earlier was that use as a mental reset was an intentional, discrete choice to prevent or to halt their negative mood. So people often would watch one video or one show to help transition activities or to relax. People also used music for this purpose, or would go on online support groups to also help kind of stop that negative mood in its tracks and then carry on with their goals for the rest of the day. And finally, people also used technologies as part of their behavioral self-regulation. And what's really interesting is that participants described using general use technologies, and this looks like technologies that weren't developed for the purposes of mental health management, but they're appropriating them for those purposes. So as a part of planning, participants described using calendar apps to plan out their social engagement throughout the week so that they had some social engagement, but not too much to feel overwhelmed. And regarding tracking behaviors, we found a really creative use from P21, who's an artist and posts a lot on Instagram. She said, I could go back and see the different moods or times in my life was going on based on art. So in this way, P21 is showing us a really creative use of a platform not developed for mood tracking, but she's able to use it for that purpose as part of her mental health self-management. So what have we learned? Well, first, we learned the importance of intentional technology use. And this looks like a process where first people began to consider how the ways they were using technologies might be influencing their mental health. And then over time, people began to monitor and creatively adjust their technology use. Now, what's important to remember here is that not everybody is at the same place in this process. Some participants we talked to are just beginning to think about how their technology and their mental health self-management might be intersecting. And other people have been thinking about this for years and had many different strategies for this management. So people could be at any point in this process. One important thing regarding implications for design that we want to drive home is the reality that for our participants who are managing depression, they did not necessarily have a positive view of technology. In fact, many of our participants viewed their smartphones as a temptation or a trap. And so as digital mental health designers, we need to have a self-awareness that the mode of intervention, in our case, technology, can be a part of the problem and a part of the solution. However, one way that we might move forward is to be able to use some of what we've learned about self-regulation theory in our design of future digital mental health technologies. For some concrete examples of how we might do this, we're thinking about perhaps integrating reflection exercises to help users understand their cycle of using technology, their thoughts, and their mood. And we're already seeing things like Facebook's developed a dashboard where you can see how long you're spending on various technologies. And I think this is a really great first step in being intentional and reflective about the technologies that we're using day to day. A particular example of how we could maybe prompt reflection is to have participants rate the effects of apps on their mood and can reflect on both the positive and negative perceived effects of using these technologies. And secondly, once people have reflected, this is a great opportunity to set new goals for technology use. So some examples of goals that we heard in our study are things like use Snapchat less or establish a support network. And so creating goals is one great step, but also we know from our study that many participants need different strategies to reach these technology goals. And so we want to support designers and users in trying out different strategies based on their needs, preferences, and abilities. And finally, this is a lot of reflection work to ask users to do themselves. And so we see a huge opportunity to discuss technology use within formal mental health care. Of our 30 participants, we only had one person who talked about technology use with their therapist. And everybody else, despite spending a lot of time on these online interactions, didn't talk about it at all. So we think that this is that informal mental health care is a great opportunity to reflect on technology use and also to set new goals. And so, in conclusion, our work highlights the creative work of individuals managing depression as they reflect on and make adjustments to their technology use to manage their mental health. Secondly, we showed that active, intentional use of a diversity of technologies could enable participants to reach new goals. And finally, regarding future design and education, we support solutions that empower people living with depression to be thoughtful and to create their own goals about technology and social media use. And with that, if you'd like to read a blog post or the full paper, please see my Twitter. We just posted both of those. And thanks to our participants and our reviewers. I'll open for questions.